Welcome to New Realities. I'm Alan Steinfeld, and I am here with one of my favorite people, I have to say, someone who's, we've been through a lot, and we've understood a lot, and we've discovered a lot together. Zachary Feder, out of the woods, Oregon. We're going to talk about maps of consciousness, right, Zachary?
Alan,
what your work has been.
So great to see you, Alan. It's true. We have been through a lot together. And thank you just so much for taking time out of being the mayor of Atlantis to talk with me today. I really appreciate it.
I love when you call me the mayor of Atlantis. That must be from that lifetime we had in Atlantis, right?
That's your Lifetime Achievement Award from the Science and Consciousness and Sedona Conference of
my past life achievement award.
Yeah.
You know. But I'm interested in what you're doing now because you used to be in New York, and of course you were the mayor of ARE in a way, the Edgar T. Foundation of New York, and but then you've kind of went into your own studies, which I think are really brilliant, and you've come up with a map for consciousness. And what do you mean by that, actually?
Well, I should also say I've had a lot of help with it. It's especially in a time like this is a collective project. This is going to be at some point, I would imagine, stepping into the commons, and it's almost going to be like a kind of Wikipedia that is supported by anyone who has legitimate insights into what this thing is. We've decoded the genome. We are experts in cartography from geography. We pretty much knew the world, 100 years ago. We understood medicine, astronomy, Grey's Anatomy. But consciousness, right? Like the psyche, like the lens through which we see the world, we're still working off of basically Freud's back of the napkin, design that he probably made while half drunk at a luncheon in 1900,
So you're saying we've done all this great work in technology, but we still haven't figured out who we are and how this mechanism for interfacing with each other mostly,
right,
and the world and ourselves, we haven't understood our own mechanics, bio-neurological, spiritual essence. We have failed ourselves.
Well, and I think what we see around us is a direct reflection of that. We've had great conversations about this in the past, that it's taken me a really long time to really realize to the full extent the degree to which the world that we have created is a reflection of our psycho-spiritual inner landscape, because it cannot be any other way. You cannot treat your children the way, outside of the way you treat yourself. There's always going to be runoff into that. We're going to leak out of that. And the same way with our communities, everything else. So, and I should also say, just to qualify, there are some great people out there who are doing work with the psyche, with consciousness, that have been around far longer than I have. And everyone at this point, you can kind of see there's been explosion essentially since the 60s. And we've kind of come to like peak awareness of multiple modalities. But now's the time, I think, to kind of synthesize into a new plateau where it's like, what do we really know to be true? What can we hold on to and say, this we know, let's start working with this as a complete model, as a holistic model.
Okay, that's a great introduction. Thank you. Now let's get down to it, okay? What is it? What is the mind? I mean, yes, of course, the mystics have worked it out to some degree, Jung, which you're influenced by, but no one, you're right, has put it all together. They're sort of like taking stabs, defining aspects of it. And even the word consciousness, so vague and almost meaningless. Of course, it's replaced God, which is a better term because you don't need to be this religious sort of understand that there's more than this reality. So what is the map you put together? Show me the map.
Yeah, I can't show you the map because there's going to be an unveiling during this course that we're going to be doing, and I'm going to be walking people through the whole thing. But I can give you, what we're talking about, what we're thinking about here, yes, which is obviously it starts with an East meets West synthesis. We take from the greats in the East that have established, well-worn pathways to meditative states, that I would call kind of that deep connection to the divine that is required pretty much breath by breath in, the suffering of life that we all experience. We need that, but especially in moments when we're on our knees, like, where do you go? You can't just go to the speeches of Malcolm X, as empowering as they are. You need some kind of embodied connection to the divine, and that's what the East gave us, and the Buddhists gave it to us, and the Zen practitioners, and many others.
And the six, and no, and the 60s, and Ram Dass, and the Beatles, and all these people that looked to the East. Of course, there was a great tradition of spirituality in the West that everyone ignores, from alchemy and the Theosophists, and all those in the early 1900s, Alice Bailey. They started to bridge the world. Here we are today with, I wouldn't even say belief in spirit, but a confirmed knowing that, yes, of course, we are more than the body. All the near-death experiences, all the out-of-body experiences, we got that. And I think that's solid with a population of this planet. Of course, there's other people watching football game, drinking beer, I have no idea, but we're not talking to those people. They'll find out at some. Here we are with a really firm foot in the world of spiritual connection, which is what we're moving, and the material world, which is all falling apart around us. But then we don't have a map for, you're saying, negotiating the terrains of a mind that links the material with the immaterial, and all the issues we have in dealing with ourselves and others. So give a little piece.
Exactly. And, we can go kind of step by step and work the whole thing through, because obviously there's, like you said, with the 60s, what I also thought was interesting with them is that they not only took transcendence, but then with, Hoffman's synthesis of LSD and what we're experiencing now, which is that second wave of psychedelics, they took the wisdom from the East and said, let's find a wormhole to get there a little quicker. And they did that, and that's what they found, like, just a super highway to it, which of course has its own downsides. But for individuals who really, really need a direct experience and don't have time to meditate for 30 years or 5 or 10 minutes, it's a great way to kind of turn on that light and have a dissolution of the self and realize, well, damn, maybe I should meditate for a little bit. So that was another thing that came along in the 60s. But then since then, the whole second part of this, and there's where I want to go to with you, which I think you're going to be interested in, because a lot of this stuff and a lot of other people know, right? But there's some deeper elements here that we really are still struggling with. And especially spiritual individuals struggle with. I know this because, I was born into the spiritual world. And so I got so much of what was great from it, but there was a big shadow side to that whole experience as well. And a lot of it had to do
your parents were sort of hippies, travelers, wanderers, and
they were fabulous. And they really took me right up to an edge, and they said, all right, now the rest is up to you. And I kind of took it and ran with it. But
they took you to the edge because, my opinion, and I know your family, is that they couldn't go further, perhaps, in their own process, or they reached a point where, okay, we're all at the same, now what, Zachary? So you're taking it to the next level. Yeah.
And I think that's how it's supposed to be with every generation. Your children are supposed to go further than you if you do everything right. And that's where I think actually we have a lot of difficulty with boomer parents and millennial and other, and X generation children. They have a difficult situation, is that a lot of the boomer parents that I know and that I've worked with, their challenge actually is because when the child explores a part of their psyche that the boomer parent has not been able to, the mirror neurons suddenly start to fire, and it becomes very uncomfortable because you're entering into a shadow place of your psyche, perhaps very courageously, and that is totally right for you to do. But as a family member, I actually feel that because we share a collective psyche in the family. And so when you go into that place, you actually drive me to drink because you're dragging a part of me with you. And so the parent will actually act like a ceiling to the development of the children, and the child, in order to maintain the love and the inclusion of the parent, will have to subdue their own desire for development. Almost like, if I love you, I repress myself. And that is one of the biggest kind of low-level family epidemics that we face now, that if you're betraying your parent if you go farther than them. We see that in chronic.
And that's what we need to do. That's the Eric Newman myth, dispose of the great mother and become your own self-aware being. But anyway, let's go into the specifics. I think you touched upon it, the shadow parts of ourselves. But what is this interior world that you sort of map beyond Freud? Freud was very simple. You know, there's the id, ego, super ego, and that didn't really say anything. That was just defining some very vague territory.
And we have to, and by the way,
says no. Yeah, go ahead.
we do have
No,
to kind of have deep bows here, because I'm not going to put myself anywhere near the footing of these titans that come before us, and especially
no,
Freud.
go ahead.
Freud,
Put yourself here.
We love to kick Freud around, but I mean, if you can imagine the titanic nature of his revelation, I mean, it was basically along the same lines of heliocentricity. I mean, he said, the world is not flat. You are not a two-dimensional cutout, and I'm going to show you this entirely other dimension.
I know, but you know what? I've been studying Freud, and Freud's big mistake that he didn't believe
Other
in
than
anything
sleeping with his
beyond the
patients?
world. Well, no. I mean, he said he developed the death wish because he thought life emanated from non-life. So all things have a desire to return to their original nature. So life has a desire to return to non-life, the dead things. But he missed, what if we didn't originate from dead things? What if we originated from a higher source of consciousness? The same logic, I'm writing about this, can be applied to, we have a desire to return to our origins of this higher realm, which is why people do drugs and meditate and, you know, do whatever because they know there's this other sense of being available to them. And we need technology, not just for understanding ourselves, but and we have this in our mechanism of consciousness, a way to attain those states. That's the thesis about Freud. He did great, but he also fell down on the job because of his limited belief.
And I would like to think that the best of us will follow in those footsteps, and if we can come up with some kind of contribution to the stream of wisdom that is coming through, we're going to also fall down in our own ways. And I look forward to my own one, because, you know, Jung did the same. You know, Freud, I mean, you're right. You're absolutely right. There were a lot of holes in what he gave us, but he still gave us, I mean, he knocked down the door to the unconscious, which is essentially the second self, which is just kind of still mind-blowing to this day to realize that, because it's invisible, it's imperceptible, and it's more powerful than you. So, I mean, how on earth they discovered this, obviously sitting with patients for years and years and years.
Well, it goes back with the history of hypnosis. Mesmer said, you know, he called it animal magnetism. He didn't realize it was subconscious, but it wasn't actually Freud that came up with it. It was kind of around since the 1860s, but they didn't have a defined territory. What Freud did was define an attempt at a territory, which was very basic and coming out of his own neurosis, his own I think repressed sexuality.
And can I also throw in, you know, we often forget too that actually Socrates, believe it or not, you know, the teacher of Plato, was intimating to the idea of some greater unconscious even back in the day, because in his early dialogues, people were saying to him, how can you know what virtue is? If you don't have a reference point for it, how are you going to recognize it? And Socrates intimated to this idea that there's some kind of a priori, right, sort of existing in advance understanding of what is right and good and true. And so that goes through the whole screen, you know, in a really beautiful way. And
no, absolutely. Socrates was a mystic. I am wanting to rewrite the true understanding of who Socrates was as the father of Western philosophy. He was mistaken as a pragmatist, but he was really a mystic. You know, he would stand sometimes and get the calling of his daemon, not demon, daemon, this inspirational force. And, you know, and we'll get back to your thing, but I just want to tell you one of my favorite dialogue of Plato talks about Socrates meeting a poet and saying to the poet, it's called the dialogue of Ion, I-O-N, do you know what makes your work so great? And the poet, the rhapsody, says, yes, it's the way I say the words and the way, you know, I put meaning into things. And Socrates says, no, That's not what makes you great. What makes you great is that you get out of the way and the gods speak through you. And when they do that, that's your greatness. When you're in the way, you're like everybody else. But anyway, so yeah, there's a whole mystical tradition that's been ignored up until now in the West that needs to be realized. But let's get back to the unconscious.
So getting back, I think the area that probably would interest you the most, just, you know, being so educated on the entire field is, and this is where I think spirituality and the New Age, and of course, you know, the last of the great gurus fell down, which is they didn't really have an understanding of depth psychology, right? And this is where all the shadow and all the flame outs took place. And, you know, you can transcend as much as you like, but I always remembered that beautiful phrase by Ken Wilber, who said, you know, you can really only transcend what you've already integrated. You know, and that speaks to it right there. Like, you can transcend an inch of your being, or you can go deeper and deeper and deeper. And just because you've transcended doesn't mean that you're not acting things out, that you don't have certain traumas that are going to affect emotional conditions that then will go into actual organ systems. And as, of course, as a Chinese medicine practitioner, you know that, you know, better than most. And so for me, the really interesting part is there are kind of two interesting parts. One is, and once again, I should also qualify all this saying, like, I don't know how we're going to roll this stuff out. You can only really roll this stuff out in a mushroom kind of way to people who are really ready for it, because most of this stuff will absolutely terrorize people. And it's kind of interesting.
Just roll it out, and then we'll deal with it once it's rolled.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Out, okay. So
the really the most interesting part that I think for me is the fact that we are working through layers and layers of trauma, essentially, right? That go back farther than we probably know, and perhaps even to the very beginning, right? And
what do you mean? How do you? I mean, I know what trauma means, but what are those? What you just can't say that. What are the traumas? What are they? If you can name them.
Raping and pillaging, murder, abandonment.
So that's all in our DNA. It's all in our lineage. It's all within the cells of our body. Every single one of those passed down.
And I'll be very clear about that. I'll be very clear about that. This kind of thing, kind of, you know, kind of drifted from the theory to the practical with me, probably over the last 5 or 6 years, working with patients suffering from chronic illness, right? So as you know, I've had the great privilege of working at Sophia Health Institute under the umbrella of Dr. Klinghardt for a long period of time. And, you know, he has come up with some incredible tools. I've worked with my own tools. One of his tools was essentially a muscle testing version on steroids that was able to enter into traumas from the past, right? And not only traumas from the recent past, but traumas from beyond that. And of course, like any practitioner that approaches, you know, any newfangled modality with a sense of cynicism and a, you know, kind of a judicious desire to make sense of it and to really test it before you believe in it, I went through this and I found it to be one of the greatest modalities that I've discovered, other than one of the ones that I use, which is kind of a somatic descent modality. It's kind of cross between hypnotherapy and various other things. And what you find is, if you work with a chronic illness patient over a long period of time, what you find is the repetition compulsion. And I'll explain this term if people don't know it, that Freud and Jung talked about a lot, which is the idea that we are repeating. There's a receptor site and an attractor site to our traumas, which means that, you know, if you've been abused, you will continue to be abused. If you've been taken advantage of, you will find yourself. And this repetition will keep going in the family, in the community.
It's an addiction. It's a subconscious genetic addiction. Would you say that?
Well, Freud said we repeat what we don't want. Freud said we repeat what we don't want to remember. Jung said we will repeat what we haven't integrated and then just call it fate. Right? So what we haven't healed.
I'm going to write.
And
let me integrate what you just said. We repeat. Wait. I just want to remember. You said we repeat what we don't want to remember. So if there's a trauma, why do we repeat it though? In order to
because the big epidemic of the world is projection. This is what war is. This is what Israel and Palestine is. This is what the Nazis and the Jews are. This is what road rage is. Everything is projection. And why is it projection? Because it's so much easier to just call you an asshole than go into my pain and weep like a baby and spend $150 an hour doing so. That's why it's hard. It's so much easier just to project it outwards onto my kids, onto my coworkers, onto the immigrants, onto the president. And so as long as I keep doing that, I'm not remembering.
This is the atrocity of humanity, a projection. This is what's at the source of all our evils, in a sense, all our lack of.
And it goes all the way back to the Greeks. And it is what all we're doing is taking pain and pushing it away from us. That's what projection is. Projection is, I'm not able to metabolize my pain. I don't know how. I have dirty dishes and I'm going to give them to my wife. And then my wife will give them to our children. And then our children will give them to the, the kind of the overweight kid at school.
So like 200 generations line, we are still dealing with the dirty dishes no one wanted to do.
That was it perfectly, Alan. That's actually my whole thesis, is that you basically take projection. You take the family unit of the child that says, can you help me, Dad? Process this emotion. I've got one dirty dish. I'm a year old and I got one dirty dish. And the father says, I can't do it. I don't know how. So I'm just going to crush that dirty dish into you. And what I'm going to create in that moment, and this is the key piece, what I'm going to create in that moment is a complicated system, not a complex system. A complex system, right, is able to self-regulate. It has generativity. It's anti-fragile. It can auto-correct. It's any of us who know how to do our dishes and do our laundry, right? It's embedded in healthy feedback loops. The minute that child starts to cry and says, can you be there, for example, in one of the 4 or 5 major ways that this map goes into, right? That says like, I have pain, can we metabolize it together? Can you be, as the father, that first exemplar of the divine that stands with unconditional love as a part of myself larger than me, that holds her and says, I got you, I'm not going to do anything, and I will let you hold that and metabolize it, and I'm not going to go anywhere. The minute we do that, we create the healthy system, right? The minute we don't do it, we create the complicated system. The complicated system is like, it's a McMansion. It's like the government right now. It's like the legal system.
Let me just absorb that. The healthy system is I have some pain caused by, I actually experienced this the other day. I had some pain that I could never really help my mother, deal with her emotional whatever it is. And so I was on the phone with her, and I still, 50 years later, not able to help her. And I just sat with that for a moment, and I felt like that pain, like, oh, I've tried my, whole life to help, and then I realized that, and I realized, well, I've tried all these years, I just can't. I just sat with that, with the sadness and the sense of that, and then something cleared, something was released. It's like, wow, I was free from that, and now whether I can or not, but I sat with, I did what you're saying, maybe for the first. So what do you suggest instead of road raging? What do we do? How do we sit? How do we look at, first, how do we discover what it is? And then how do we be with it, I guess?
So, I love your example, because I think that is one of the most common examples that we see just in the chronic illness world and in the world of individuals. I described you and there are lots of examples I have of this, as you're the circuit breaker that essentially ends the cycle of trauma that would have started long before your mother, because that dynamic between you and her was just the most recent overflow from her and her mother, or her and her father, or a little bit of both, and then her and her grandparents, and all the way back. And that's, once again, all the projection is, she wasn't able to stand in that place of the divine feminine that says, I'm here for you, you're my son. And this is old Bert Hellinger stuff. This would be the element of this work that I would probably
also the drama, The Gifted Child,
Yeah,
Alice Miller. She's great. Anyway, so yeah.
yeah,
So
that was
yes,
great.
she
The
wasn't
one,
there.
I'll tell
Yeah,
you one thing that I would shift with that, and it's not even a shift. It's just like
yeah.
one of the things that I've kind of found a way a lot through family constellation, actually, of supporting that even further, is that, most people get stuck because they want to have that conversation with their mom, and essentially they want to give back what I now see and know to be true, to be actual physical energy. There's an energy burden that you and others will have taken on from the mother, right? That actually gets embedded in certain chakra
Right.
systems, certain corresponding organ systems, certain emotional patterns, and then behavioral patterns. So all of that stuff, it has such a fractal, all pervasive overflow into life. And that's the first most important step, really, is to sit with it. Like, I don't see any other better thing to sit with it. But one of the things that I've really worked with a lot, and of course, when you talk about such subtle energy, sacred, hallowed moments such as this over a random, as much as I love it, YouTube video over the internet, you're going to lose some of the real sacredness to it. But I'll explain it anyway. And the idea is,
Please.
what I've noticed is you can actually connect to a part of your mother that is beyond her earthly shell and personality and
Right.
idiosyncrasies. You can connect to a part of her there, and you can begin to establish right relationship with that part of her, whether it's her soul, whether it's her higher self. It doesn't really matter. And some people are not, there's a whole spectrum of individuals who, I always say, God bless them, but the people who were not able to do this were frat boys. Frat boys can't do this. They just
No.
don't have that embodied sensitive self that is online yet. And so we have to do something completely different. But
Okay.
if you're able to do it, you connect to that part of your mother and you go into those deep, deep states and you attune yourself to those energies and where they exist actually in your body. And you essentially give that back. And that's one of the most powerful parts of my practice that happens all the time. And people
It
just
is.
weeping to get rid of this stuff.
Actually, Costa calls that recapitulation. There's a technique where
Yeah.
you breathe that energy back into your, but you also have to breathe out the energy, whether it's your mother or old girlfriend or somebody you've had some traumatic moments
Right.
with. You breathe out of yourself as well. You give that back to the person as
And
well.
it's a death as well, because it's the death of what I would call a part of your conditioned self. Because all of that has
Right, but it's a
nothing really.
freedom as well.
The freedom that
It's
comes
a
out of that
rebirth.
is when you let go of that conditioned self, of that conditioned role that, kind of you were given. And we have been given many, many, many conditioned roles early in life. And I think part of the
Right.
transition is acknowledging the conditioned self. And then that is one of the early deaths that I think that we experience. That's one of the early psychological deaths that if it gets brought to us, we are invited to usher ourselves into the authentic self.
Right. So let's go back to the map, because I saw some people online in the chat talking, maybe asking questions. But map is, okay, the trauma, deep in everyone, layers and layers of trauma trapped that condition our behavior, our personality, our interaction with each other, the outcome of relationships, how we raise children. So we have to dig that up and be with it. And okay, that's
Here's the piece
difficult,
that
but
I
what
think
else?
here's the piece that I think most people don't go to. There are two places where most of us fall off. If we're in the spiritual world, we'll fall off on the deep psychological interface of the internalized parents. We kind of just gloss over that, and we won't go into it in detail. And what that does is it actually will continue to kind of act like hooks in our ability to ascend or transcend or whatever it is we want to do at those quote unquote higher levels. If we're on the deep psychological level, we'll miss the spiritual side, and we won't be able to go into the surrender and the disillusionment and those deeper, higher states of connecting to the divine, which, if you're an artist or a writer, you kind of allowing the divine to flow through you and kind of letting go. Those are the two areas. But for our purposes here today, the piece that I think needs to be reintegrated, right, are two pieces. One is what we're talking about. which people don't want to go into because it's one of the hardest things. It's the deepest, darkest, murkiest thing. And it's really what I call, I look at it almost like the original Trinity. We have the Trinity, which, okay, in one ways you can talk about that as a patriarchal, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, right? It's kind of patriarchal. It's like, where's the divine feminine in that? Now, okay, some people can, Jordan Peterson will go into a whole big spiel about that, and I appreciate that from one angle. The original esoteric Trinity that I am really obsessed with and like working with, that I think is the ground that we must cut our teeth in, that all spiritual work and psychological work stands on top of, is it's not the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It's the Father, the Mother, and the Holy Spirit. So you got the Father, and the Mother. The Father, the Mother,
and the Mother, our personal Father and Mother, and our spirit, or the Spirit itself. You mean
our spirit?
Do you mean
that enters into the stream of time, into the spliced DNA of the Mother and the Father and the ancestry. And so before we know who we are, yeah, both. So it's not just dad and mom and all the epigenetic material that they give us. It's all of their epigenetic material from their ancestry.
Right.
You have two huge.
Before we know who. Right. So you were saying before we know who we are, we have to know our lineage. Is that where you're going with that? Or
before we know who we are our lineage. So before we are who we are, we become. So this is another one that's been forgotten, through the annals of time with the great insights of Jung, let's say. The internalized mother and the internalized father, which back in the day was used to call the superego. Not a great descriptor for it because it really kind of suggests a lot of other things. But when the child is born, every single word and deed that the mother and the father express, either in the presence of the child or directly to the child, acts as a line of code that actually creates the motherboard and the fatherboard of the entire self-sense of the child. Now, bear in mind, the authentic self of the child, it hasn't fully been incarnated yet. It's in a kind of nascent form.
No, but I do want to add to that, and not quite disagree, but as that soul enters the mother, father, it has its own destiny.
Yes.
And it has its own reason for incarnating, and either the family run interference from the past, or
it does.
But those are also maybe obstacles that were chosen as part of the incarnational mission to achieve clarity. So you pick parents like this in order, because that's what your soul wants to know.
Maybe that's maybe. Actually that's a well-loved New Age belief that comes from a psychological function of wanting to make the best of what otherwise might feel like a really horrible situation. It's possible.
I agree with that.
You don't actually know.
But the soul does have a destiny of why it incarnated.
Absolutely. This is destiny. This is daimon, as you said. This is genius. This is mission. And, it's funny. It's like, once again, it's like, oftentimes the winners describe, and in this regard, I say the winners describe, what we think is actually happening. Go and talk to the chronic illness world, the individuals who have not been able to do their mission, who have been kind of embedded and have been struggling to get through the layer upon layer of epigenetic, like you so rightly put, interference that is run from the motherboard, the fatherboard, the grandparents on both sides, it's really like the father and mother are the first, then the grandparents, they play a big role often. And then after that, it's the lineage, right? The ancestry. And what you find is disconnect ourselves and distangle ourselves from these things requires increasing levels of sensitivity. Like to connect to the lineage and understand the ways in which you may be repeating something in the lineage that is maladaptive or not supportive requires tremendous sensitivity. And what we find is that I think pretty much in any life, right, you have really one of three options. Either you step into that stream of time, your daimon is actually not ready to come out in this lifetime. There are many people like that. We mustn't think that everyone has a genius and a daimon, and I use genius in the term of mission, right? Destiny. Not everyone has one that's actually ready to come out. And those are the people that, and I don't say this in a disparaging term, but that toe the party line of the family. You just toe the party line. You're following everybody else. You're not the black sheep. It's usually the black sheep, actually, who kind of come to a place where at some point you realize you're at a crossroads. And what it usually feels, and it's funny, I think that most people who suffer from chronic illness, to a certain degree, the vast majority are actually, those are the individuals who are desperate to step in their destiny, but they are entangled with a hydra like repression of the family unit that says, if you embrace your destiny, you will be abandoned, you will be criticized. And that's actually, I think, a huge part of the chronic illness conundrum that we face, because you have someone who suddenly finds themselves in a rock and a hard place, that if they step into their destiny, they're abandoned by their family, or they have their father turns their back on them, or their mother.
Right.
And
So
that creates autoimmunity.
Right. So the black sheep in the family are those, like maybe you have decided, we're not going to be ruled by conforming. We're going to overcome that and be with the disconnection from the family. I've lived with that, and it's okay. I mean, I rather do that than trying to fit into something that doesn't work. I mean,
I often don't think we even have a choice. I mean, you know this. It's like you don't have a choice. You feel that you feel constricted. You're wearing a shirt that's too tight for you, and you have to go out. I can't be a lawyer like you, Dad. I can't do it. And you know what? Maybe even I tried, and I burned out, and I had a nervous breakdown, or whatever it might be. So you have to separate.
Are you seeing chronic illness in the people who couldn't break away from conforming? Is that that's where you're seeing it?
I mean, that's one element of what I'm seeing. One of the two biggest trends that I see in chronic illness, and there are a lot, right? But two of the biggest ones is they're not allowed to follow their mission. And that's probably for me, one of the deepest esoteric versions of autoimmunity. It's when your soul's desire is being crushed by what you feel to be the need that you have to respect your father. So your love of your father will repress your soul. That's autoimmunity at the deepest level, as far as I'm concerned. The second version is you follow your mission, but you're abandoned by your family, or you're criticized by your family. And that would be, for example, even coming out of the closet, being homosexual, being queer, being transgender, and having your family say to you, we're going to take you to conversion therapy. And then having a nervous breakdown.
Or just giving up the religion came from, just saying, no, I don't want to be this or that religion. That's another abandonment. Yeah.
And let's just dovetail back to this map, right? And this idea where this map and where I'm thinking some of this work is going to be really useful for people is the fact that most people try to navigate that process directly with the earthly personality and of the father. You're never going to, and it doesn't work. You can't have a conversation with your father. He's not going to do it. And so what people do is they end up
saying to your father, excuse me, I don't believe in your religion and I'm doing my own thing. And that's,
you can't really have, it just doesn't work. You can't really have a truly conscious conversation where, let's say, what you really want is the father to say, you know, son, daughter, you know, what I've come to realize is that it's my own psycho-spiritual limitations that are getting triggered by your journey. And I'm going to own that now. And I'm really sorry. You know, it just triggers me. I have issues of this, and it comes back to my father. And I'm going to step out of that. I'm going to let you do your journey. And I'm going to love you the way a father should, unconditionally. And I'm going to support you in that. And I don't care. And you do your thing, right? We can't actually have those conversations with the actual human personality. And so what people do is
no, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. As you're talking, I'm just feeling, you know, my father did acknowledge my path, which made it a lot smoother and a lot more of a connection for me to follow, which was a really beautiful gift. But anyway, you're
amazing.
Most people have that conversation. So what happens then to them?
Well, what happens is the system breaks down, and if they're lucky, they might find a therapist, and they would project their idealized father onto the therapist or a mentor, someone else, and they would get the transmission that they're looking for, but it would never be enough. Because what needs to really happen is that what I find the most effective thing is where the energy suddenly starts to shoot out and it starts to work at a whole other level is when you do connect to the soul of the father or some version of this higher father, and you actually have that conversation with him, and you actually throw the kitchen sink at him. Why do you throw the kitchen sink? And it's kind of, we could talk about this in a lot of detail, because a lot of people, they actually confront that. I had someone the other day, and it's like, people have difficulty with this because they've been so deeply gaslighted by the parents into
What
saying,
does that mean? What does that mean? By the parents?
gaslighted is when you're a prisoner and you fall in love with your prisoner and you say, you know what, actually my prison is actually pretty nice, and actually they're pretty nice to me. You know, they give me gruel twice a day. It's not so bad, and actually I should be really grateful to them. That's being gaslighted. That's being persuaded into the idea that your suppression of your soul is actually not so bad, and really your father did the best he could, and there's nothing wrong with that, and you know, you should actually just be grateful. That's actually
What, you know, that's no, but that's actually happening worldwide right now in the coronavirus epidemic, pandemic crisis, is that, oh, it wasn't sad destroying the earth and not having air that we could breathe and people suffering and being homeless. You know, it's not, I mean, we've made a lie that all that was okay. And now we're being slammed in the face with everyone's situation, saying maybe that wasn't okay, and maybe what some people were doing were not okay, and this is a big chance to look at all those, let's call them demons, we ignored, that we're living with, that we thought were okay. So
right, exactly. And once
yes.
again, that's a larger extrapolation. And the way I look at the entire world are just increasingly complex extrapolations of the original dysfunction that we still haven't dealt with at the family level, at the core level. It's like, just find peace with your spouse. Can you do that? Then find peace with your children. Can you do that? Then find peace with your community. Can you do that? Before you go to Africa and build wells and try to find peace, before you try to solve the healthcare system, just try to find peace with your spouse. Because if you don't do that, then every higher level function that you attempt to address, you're going to drag all those inabilities with you, and they're going to actually explode at higher levels of dysfunction. And that's actually what, once again, Jordan Peterson mentioned in his first rule for life, which I very much appreciated: make your bed. That's what he was saying. Make your bed. Can you make your bed? Okay, before you kind of address all these systemic, multidimensional problems in big life, can you actually just clean your room? Because that's actually what happens. Once again, that's a projection. Going to Africa is a projection. And I'm not saying it's bad. Like, I think charity is a great thing.
Oh no, I think we
but
have
if it's
to
done
do
off,
both.
But if it's done off the back of not cleaning your bed, it's another projection of like, I can't actually get along with my spouse. And if I get someone in Africa to, have a well or anything else, then I'll feel better about myself, that I can't get along with my spouse. And that's why, you hear all these stories about the UN doing interventions over there, and all the Africans looking like, why are you here? Like, the indigenous people, they're not stupid. They look at you and they're like, why are you here? You're doing something for you. Like, we didn't ask you to come here.
Well,
They
that's what I always say about political activists in general, projections of a need for their parents to hear them or to scream. That's what's wrong with politicians in general, because they want attention
Alan,
they never got. Yes.
I got to get out of here.
I know you do, but I have a proposal. So why don't we take up the conversation every Monday, if you can, around this time, the other maps of consciousness. The first one is look at the levels and levels of trauma. That's step one. And I think people should study this, but okay, do you want to do this? Like,
let's explore it next Monday. Let's do it. I think we touched upon a ton of stuff that has so much juice in it. Let's get into it a little deeper. I'd love to.
Yes. And I'll get questions and feedback. Thank you, Zachary, for hard work and for being a good friend.
Thank you so much, Alan, for taking time out of, going into jump rooms to Mars and alien abductions to talk with me tonight. It was just a joy.
Those are just avoidance mechanisms. Those are avoidance, Zachary.
I love you.
I'm dealing with it.
I love you. Let's talk about the psychological implications of the Illuminati. I mean, that's another interesting one. So
I want to talk about all that, but that's still projection. I want to talk about just the base map of consciousness. You've only given us one thing today. Let's go through point so people know how to operate the machinery they've been given,
I love it.
Don't operate machinery without instructions. Okay.
Great to see you, Alan.
Thanks.
Lots of love.
thanks for your time. And I'll say, I'll just go back to my ending. I'm talking to Zachary Feder from the backwoods somewhere, and his insights and his understanding of what's possible for human behavior. So we're going to repeat this series. We're going to start it every Monday, starting at around 3 p.m. East Coast time. And I'm Alan Steinfeld for New Realities. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned to other live streams. Please give me some feedback about today's talk, and we'll pursue some of those questions in the next upcoming dialogues. Alan Steinfeld and Zachary Feder, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Okay?